Hello and welcome back to the Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow. We are here for the penultimate episode of season 2, episode 7. It is a big episode. I actually think that today when we were planning for this episode, is the hardest I have worked to try to figure out what we are going to prioritize because there's so much that happens in this episode. I am joined back here. I should introduce myself. My name is Kelsie Paul. I am the manager of interpretation at the Frick Pittsburgh. I am joined by two of my colleagues again. We have Dawn Reed Breen, our chief curator here at the Frick, and then we have our director of learning and visitor experience, our education department, Amanda Gillen. I'm going to start, as I always do, with a synopsis. I will also say I had to add a little bit to it because the synopsis didn't even do justice to everything that was happening. So in episode 7 of HBO's The Gilded Age, as New York celebrates a historic event, Bertha reconsiders her loyalty to the Met, while Marion doubts her future. Meanwhile, Ada and Oscar suffer major losses, different types of losses. We will get to them, of course. But let's start with Mrs. Astor and Bertha. This is a new stage of the opera wars here. And the note that I put down is that Mrs. Astor makes Bertha an offer that she thinks she can't refuse. She basically goes to Bertha and says, if you want it, it's yours. You can have your box at the academy. And she thinks that Bertha is going to accept, hands down. I don't know about you guys. There was no part of me that believed that Bertha was going to accept that box. I think she's come too far in her battle for the Met. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah, I don't know. I liked that she talked with George about it. I felt like I could see her waffle in the beginning. And I like that he talked her into it. Yep. And then I remembered he does have some ulterior motives for the success yes. of the Opera House because he has been funding it, which she does not know. But I thought he made his argument quite well.
Yes, he did. I don't know. What are you about, Amanda? What did you think she was going to do?
I think she waffled too, because it was her original goal and it would mean something more than just the box, right? It's about finally reaching that level with all of those people who shunned her at the beginning. And I think making the choice, though, to stay with the Metropolitan, she's also making a choice that I'm going to continue this, not like rebellious rogue path, but I'm going to continue to be a trailblazer. I'm not content to sort of settle into society in Mrs. Astor's world. I actually want to keep driving things forward. But then what happens when she turns her down? That was not smart. Bertha should have just said, no, let's chat outside or let's have lunch or I need to talk to you about that. But to tell Mrs. Astor in front of every woman they know,
yeah, very public,
was not going to to take the box. That was not smart. That was a misstep, I think, on Bertha's part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or maybe intentional, but I think she knew that was not good, what she did.
Yes. Yeah, it's one of those things where that's probably it does come back to bite her essentially because it lights a fire under Mrs. Astor. So now Mrs. Astor is going after the Duke and we have this dumb Duke who's just sort of floating around in the background being a pawn between these two women. But yeah, I think it wasn't Bertha's most tactful moment. Mm-hmm. She has moments where she can be extremely tactful, and she can manipulate things in a really nuanced way. That was not one of them. I think my favorite part about that scene is actually Mamie Fish, though, because in the background of that whole scene, she looks so mortified. She won't look up from her teacup. And then after Oscar comes in and has his whole thing, which we'll get to, I just love her line. I think she says something like, "This is just so delicious," or something like that. She's
thrilling. That was thrilling.
So thrilling. She's like, "This is amazing." There's
even
so
better was Aurora's eye roll and sigh after, because she says it to Aurora, and Aurora is just like, "Oh, I can't even."
I feel like Mamie is what we call a drama llama. She's like, what's happening?
She loves it. She's like, I don't need to do anything. I'm just going to sit with popcorn and watch these people implode. And it's the most entertaining thing. So
I have a question real quick. What you guys think? Do you think Bertha cares about the Duke because of Gladys or because of the prestige that connection gives her, or both? I was trying to figure out why she still cares about the Duke, because she beat Turner. So
yeah.
Is it because of Gladys maybe wanting to sort of connect her and maybe marry her off?
I think that's the long game that she hasn't maybe really expressed to anyone. That is a card maybe that she's holding close to the vest. I do think that's the long game. But I also think it's just at this point, you're right. She stole him away from Turner, and now he's her Duke. And so I think it's just a pride thing, like an ego thing, that how dare, Mrs. Astor now take him from her. But I do think it's both. I think ultimately it's both.
Yeah.
Yeah. Pondering that the other night.
Well, we're going to see. I mean, I think we're going to see how this ends up. The opera wars are definitely going to come to a head. So I'm sure we'll be spending a lot of time next week talking about that. So we do want to make sure that we get to all of the other big things. We will get to Oscar in a second, but let's talk a little bit about Ada and Luke. That storyline comes to a devastating end in this episode. In the middle of all of this other stuff that is going on, there are some really quiet and sad moments between Ada and Luke. I think my biggest complaint, and we talked a little bit about this, I think last week and maybe even the week before, boy, could they have rushed this storyline anymore. I told my husband that they went from married to back pain to dead in 3 episodes. Could not have done this fast enough. I did read a comment from a lovely viewer that mentioned that they had listened to, I think, the official podcast, the casting director. They only had the actor who played Luke for a very short amount of time. So that probably played into it. But it's really too bad because it really does rush everything to this really sad conclusion. But we've now watched Ada go from, quote unquote, a spinster to the married woman that she, didn't think she was ever going to be. And now she has transitioned into this new phase, which is widowhood, which I think we'll see a little bit of next week. But, I think we talked a little bit about mourning customs in season 1 within the context of Marion, mourning her dad, which is how we meet her in the beginning. But Dawn, remind us a little bit about probably what we're going to see from Ada, because widowhood is a whole kind of different thing for a woman in this era that Ada is going to have to navigate.
Yeah. So, I mean, mourning wear is one of the most public ways of displaying your grief. So wearing black was this outward display of your emotional state. It was a sign of respect for the person that you had lost. And in this era of etiquette and all of these prescribed social customs, there was a certain amount of time that you were expected to grieve depending on your relationship to the person that you lost. So generally, widows were held to the highest standards, like they were expected to be in deep mourning for the longest time, which was generally 1 year. Some sources say 2 years. So that is like deep mourning, wearing the deep black, no sheen, no shine to your garments. You're usually wearing like a bombazine or a crepe, no satin, nothing with embellishments or beading or anything. And I forgot, we saw Peggy and her family in mourning at the beginning of this season too. So I'm wondering if it will come full circle and we'll see Ada in her mourning wear at the end of this season. But it's such a crushing moment, especially for Ada, who we want to see happy, but also such a reminder that death was a commonplace reality for a lot of 19th century people, regardless of their class or social status.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always something that transcends everything else through life. It's a universal experience, and certainly was in the 19th century. It just something that I've been thinking about is Ada, as a quote unquote spinster, as a single unmarried woman, she really was reliant on Agnes, for pretty much all of her adult life. She lived with Agnes. That was part of the thing that Agnes was struggling with, was letting go of, Ada having her as a companion. Mm-hmm. She's now had this really short-lived independence as a married woman. But it's going to be interesting to see, because a lot of widows in the 19th century, that how they're going to support themselves was a huge concern. So I know, widows often did remarry because out of, a necessity to, have some financial stability through the form of a husband, but they also are expected to mourn for a year. So it seems like Ada is probably going to be moving back in with Agnes, but she's now it's unclear sort of what the financial situation will be for her from Luke, but that was a really vulnerable state for women to be in, to not have in the 19th century, to not have a husband necessarily to be able to rely on.
But it is so interesting because as a widow, because she has been a married woman on a social status ladder, she is the equal of her sister in a way where had she remained unmarried, even in a similar financial plight, like her social status would be even lower.
Yeah, I kind of forget that Agnes is also a widow because it's very clear that Agnes is fine with it. Like, Agnes doesn't really care that she's a widow, and she's been a widow. I think we get the sense that her husband has been gone for a long time. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see them come back together, living together potentially, but now more as equals.
Gonna be different. I mean, it was actually, as awful as Agnes has been up until the last couple episodes, as soon as he got sick, she was 100% there for her sister. And the scene where she sits by Luke and they talk is lovely and actually one of her best. And that she's got that side to her where she does care deeply about everybody. And what she said, of course, I'll take care of her. She's my little sister. Like, she doesn't use affectionate words all the time. But there was and Ada, she is who Ada goes to. Ada cried heartbreakingly twice on her shoulder in the last couple episodes. And they're forever changed by all this, their relationship. Of course, there's other things that are changing their lives big time. But Ada's not inexperienced and it was brief, but it still changed her world. And I don't know. Yeah. I just thought the show gave Agnes a chance to be something else. And that was really lovely to see play out for her, for all of them, really.
Yeah, it's lovely to see the more tender side of Agnes and how that translates to her relationship with Ada, that they are really loving sisters. So it's nice to see that. Let's talk a little bit about the other big change, though, that is happening in the Van Ryn household as a result of some choices that Oscar has made. Ada, if she's, it sounds like she's probably going to end up moving back in. It doesn't sound like, though, the Van Ryns are going to be in the financial situation to take on additional people to financially support. We learn what Dawn suspected, which is that Oscar was being taken for a ride by Maud Beaton. Turns out she was in on it, as far as we can tell. And she basically was not who she said that she was. She was essentially a con woman. And for those of you, again, who have listened to the official podcast, producer Luke Harlan spoke a little bit about it this week, about who they modeled Maud off of, which I found really fascinating because, like they often do in this show, they based her off of a couple of different real life people, but specifically a woman named Cassie Chadwick, who really did swindle bankers out of millions of dollars. And she basically had a bunch of different ways that she did that, but her most famous and maybe noteworthy way was that she went around telling people that she was the illegitimate daughter of Andrew Carnegie and using that as a way to kind of promise that she was good for money. Dawn, I know you mentioned you did some reading. She's a wild one. I had not read anything about her, but she is fascinating.
I didn't know anything about her until I read that the character of Maud was based on her. But it seems like she was a schemer, from an extremely young age.
Yes.
And she even at one point had calling cards, which I think we have talked about in the first season. You would present to your social acquaintances calling cards written up that said Miss whatever her last name alias was at that moment, heiress. So literally telling people that she was coming from money. But it says so much about the 19th century, and something we talked about with Mrs. Winterton, how easy it is to create a false identity for yourself in this moment where there's no digital record or photographic record that's easily accessible. The fact that she could just kind of, whisper in people's ears that she was the illegitimate daughter and somehow swindle people out of millions of dollars. I don't know how factual this story is, but apparently Andrew Carnegie was offended that people thought or that believed that it was him because there were like misspellings and poor handwriting. And so he felt, offended that people would believe he was the writer of those, promissory notes.
Yeah, I read that he was also Cassie Chadwick does eventually get arrested. She is held accountable. And, Oscar makes the comments several times throughout the show that he doesn't think there's going to be any recourse for him. He believes Maude is gone. She's never going to be held accountable for what she's done. And even if they catch her, the money's not coming back. There's no way to get the money back. Cassie Chadwick, though, does eventually end up in jail for her crimes, for her financial crimes. Carnegie apparently attended the trial. And my favorite comment, if it is historically accurate, was that he basically was like, someone could have just asked me. Like he basically said it could have saved everybody a lot of time if someone had just checked. But yeah, Maude, she's quite adept at what she has done. I mean, she convinced Aurora, Aurora ended up being sort of her doorway in. And it's interesting, Aurora says, I don't even know how I met her. Like, she can't even remember. She can't, and so she can't even pinpoint the moment that Maude came into their lives. But yeah, when you have no way to check on any of these things, why wouldn't you believe a woman like Maude, who clearly has the confidence to be able to embody this character that she has made for herself?
Yeah, she worked her way in beautifully. And it makes me think of Newport, when they were all at Newport at the tennis matches and there were all those people. And it's like, for all the fussiness about who's who, there's also an ease to, if you look the part and you sound the part, my family so-and-so from, Rhode Island or so, I think there's because you can't check. And people also don't want to say, well, I've never heard of them. So there's a way, like, it's like Maude found the exact tone to sort of ingratiate herself. And you're right. All you need is one reputable woman to start introducing you. And then suddenly you are also, with Oscar, you think it was like it flipped it in such a sad way because Aurora's been chiding him, don't be scamming her, don't be leading her on, don't be tricking her. And look what happened, like it was the exact opposite. So they had us thinking that he was, gonna sort of pull a fast one with her or marry her, and he shouldn't. And it's like the total opposite. But yeah, Maude, whoever, if she was involved in it, she was incredibly smart at getting herself ingratiated.
Well, clearly, like, I think the moment that really threw me, because I was thinking maybe it was just that man and the company and maybe Maude wasn't involved. But when he goes to the house, it made me remember a scene, I think in a previous episode, that seemed like a throwaway moment when he comes to pick her up, but she's already waiting outside. And so he never actually sees her like come out of this house where he has picked her up and dropped her off. And I was like, oh my God, she's truly a genius.
I was wondering if she pulled that off, but that's right. She wasn't. Yeah.
Huh. Like, that's when I was like, ooh, this is getting eerie.
Yeah. And that just moment where you really see it click and Oscar really becomes unhinged in a way when he goes to the house and is demanding to see Maude, and he has that realization from the actual owner of the house who says, I don't know who you're talking about. This woman does not live here. And he has this moment where I think it all finally clicks that he has been had. And then to have to go to Agnes and tell her that not only has he, does Maude Beaton not exist? Because I think, Agnes was really excited that Oscar was maybe going to settle down. She approved of Maude. She felt very good about this match potentially. But to be told that she doesn't exist, she's not who she said she was. Oh, and by the way, almost all of our family fortune is now gone. Amanda and I had a brief conversation yesterday about what that would really truly mean for a family like the Van Ryns or a family like the Fricks. Bad business deals were happening all the time in the Gilded Age. They happen now, certainly. We talk a lot about these vast fortunes being made in the Gilded Age, but there were also plenty of fortunes that were lost just as easily. This is obviously an extreme case, but, where do they go from here? Where does a family like the Van Ryns go from here with not having that financial capital to back their social and their cultural standing?
Maybe Luke was extremely wealthy and Ada will be well set, and they're going to like flip and reverse roles, and Ada will end up taking Agnes and Oscar in.
I actually thought about that Sunday night. Like, I wonder if she's going to inherit or at least enough money to keep them going. I know. We'll see. That would be a tidy end to the season.
Well, the other thing that could happen is Marion and Larry could finally get together, which I am hoping is definitely going to happen. But obviously, Larry is very well off. Marion could be the one to save the day. It's unclear how well off Dashiell is. I mean, he seems to be wealthy enough. He's doing fine, but I don't know that he necessarily is going to save the whole family. But
Marion will have Agnes and Ada moving in with her, or maybe they'll all just stay in that house together.
Oh, all full circle flipped around.
Yeah, and it would be interesting because then if she gets together with Larry, then it's Russell money that saves the Van Ryns, which we know Agnes would never get over.
Never accept.
That would be Agnes's worst nightmare, to be beholden in any way to Bertha and her new money. But yeah, it's like we talk a lot about, within the context of the Fricks in the 19th century, this idea that it's not just financial capital, it's social capital, it's who you know, it's your name. Agnes has a lot of pride in the Van Ryn name. And you have cultural capital in terms of the charities you support and the art you collect and all of these things. But it really does, at the end of the day, hinge on that financial capital. You can't maintain the social and the cultural capital necessarily if you don't have the financial capital to back it. So it's going to be interesting to see how they're able to navigate that. But it's definitely a devastating blow, I think, to all of them, and quite the twist.
And the servants. I was thinking about the staff. I mean, are they going to be able to? I mean, this could impact, the ripple effect all the way down. You can't support a live-in staff like that with, I mean, it's just, they don't even know what's coming yet. And I wonder if they'll hide it. Like, I wonder if they'll hide, if Agnes will, you don't want to run around telling everybody you're bankrupt, how are they going to keep this from sort of getting out into the world? We have one episode left, right? To see what happens.
Yeah, we have one episode left, so we're going to see what happens in our at the end of the season. So to be continued for sure. We do want to turn our attention to obviously the other big thing that was happening in the episode. The whole episode really revolves around this opening of the Brooklyn Bridge, which we kind of knew was coming because we had been laying the groundwork in some previous episodes with the construction. This is a totally historically true event that did happen. The Brooklyn Bridge opened for the very first time on May 24th, 1883, with this huge citywide celebration, fireworks. It was a really, really big deal. Not only had the construction been going on for more than a decade, it was a very long time coming, but it was at the time the longest suspension bridge in the world. So it was a really important, technological feat at the time. But Dawn, you were pointing out the same thing, another really important thing, which is that I think a lot of people don't realize, I certainly didn't, that Brooklyn and Manhattan were two totally separate worlds. They were separate cities at this time, and you couldn't even travel between them any other way than by boat before this bridge went up. So it was a big deal.
And we hear so many times in the episode, like how easier it's going to be for Peggy, especially like for people to get back and forth and across. And like you said, they were two extremely different cities, like really populous. So the fact that they could connect them, I mean, they wouldn't be kind of annexed as New York City proper and with all of the other boroughs. I think Manhattan and Brooklyn joined in 1898. So it's still another decade or 15 years until they connect the two properly.
But a really interesting, thing, we obviously see Emily again. She's hosting this really big party essentially at her house with the president coming. President Chester Arthur shows up, which did actually happen. He did come to the opening of the bridge. He did go to a reception at the Roebling home. But we have all of these continued conversations about what Emily's role was, how much credit should she get. Initially there's these interesting conversations, I think, between Bertha and maybe Mrs. Astor, or Bertha and someone else, about, oh, she's got this big party that she has to throw, and there's so much pressure and all of that stuff. When, Larry is aware of the real role that she is playing here, which is that she got that bridge built, which is a really interesting, I think, juxtaposition to see. But yeah, I mean, a huge moment for her. And she has this really interesting conversation with Larry at the party about basically, people are going to say that I helped my husband, complete this project. They're never going to really give me credit. But apparently she did actually get a decent amount of credit in the newspaper at the time. I mean, people did recognize that she had something to do with this and that it wouldn't have happened without her. So she really is a fascinating figure. And I'm glad that we got to kind of see her story come kind of more full circle. But the other thing, I don't know if you guys have heard about this, but 12 days after the Brooklyn Bridge opened, there was a massive stampede on the pedestrian walkway. Several people died because there was a lot of fear around whether or not this bridge was actually going to be stable, because it was the longest bridge of its type at the time. People thought, like, certainly this thing can't be safe. And so basically this incident happens where a woman trips, someone screams, and this whole thing ends up with a stampede on the Brooklyn Bridge. So much so that, fun fact, a year after that, P.T. Barnum led 21 elephants across the Brooklyn Bridge as a PR stunt to prove that it was in fact safe and it could carry weight. So I thought that was interesting.
I have two things to say. One is that I have walked the Brooklyn Bridge. I highly recommend it. I walked it with my girlfriend in New York City. It is terrifying and also like the coolest thing ever. You're walking above the cars, if I remember this right. And it goes on. It took forever. It takes forever. I can with all my knowledge in modern times, I can understand why people were like, I don't know about this, because it is scary, but beautiful. The second thing is that a colleague of ours emailed me that there is a Roebling museum in New Jersey. She says it's a super cool site, and they posted an article about Emily Roebling appearing on the Gilded Age TV show. So we can just wanted to mention that to people. You can go and look that up and learn a little bit more about Emily and Roebling and the bridge story. So just wanted to throw that out there for our viewers. I haven't looked yet at the website and the museum, but I would like to check it out. So if you're interested in that storyline, there's a whole museum that could tell us more.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, she's such an interesting character. I will say, I will throw that in. If you're interested in the Cassie Chadwick stuff, look that up as well. Dawn and I brushed the surface. Yes. Her story is wild. The things that she managed to convince people to do is insane. There's a great article in Smithsonian Magazine that you can find online that Dawn and I probably both read, which takes you through basically her entire life from her very beginnings of being a con woman, and it is fascinating. So definitely do more research if you're interested, because there's lots of information out there. The last thing we just really wanted to touch on quickly is something that we started talking about last week. We saw this big showdown in Pittsburgh with George and his decision ultimately to save the lives essentially of these workers at the steel mill. He intervenes at the last moment to stop the militia from firing upon them. And we discussed that there were going to be ramifications to that decision. We see that a little bit in this episode. We see George have to basically get in front of these other industrialists and basically justify the decision that he makes. And he also has a meeting with Henderson. They do a little bit of a PR moment where they get their photograph taken, shaking hands. They've essentially made this deal But you see the ways that George is still trying to play by that playbook. He says time and time again, I'm dividing them. I've given a raise to the tradesmen. I haven't given a raise to the quote unquote unskilled laborers. It's going to divide them. They're going to, fight amongst each other rather than fighting with us. But I think it's a really telling moment when he does get in that room with the other industrialists where they essentially feel like he has screwed them all over because he has shown weakness, and so he has now put them in a position where they have to make a similar choice, which I feel like is what we thought was going to happen. So, but he stands by it. He stands by his decision and justifies it and seems to think that he is not in a position of weakness because he has done this, which I'm interested to hear both of your guys' thoughts on that in terms of, where he's going to go from here, because this is an interesting thing for him to put all of his stock in, essentially.
I am not sure that was his plan in the moment. I think this is an idea that he's come. I genuinely responded with his heart, and he is a decent man, and he was not going to have those men mowed down in front of him. But then on the train ride back to New York was probably like, I have to figure this out because now I've done this. And his plan is, I think, legitimate and smart, but I think he's leaning into it because he knows he put himself and others. It depends on how you look at it, but it's interesting to think about his peer pressure, if you will, coming from these other very hardline industrialists. Because, and we talk about this with Henry Clay Frick a lot here, right? Because none of them are operating in a vacuum. They're making their choices and doing what their peers are doing. But even if you want to try and do quote unquote the right thing, you've got your own group that's pressuring you in different ways. So I think he's walking that line, and he's very sharp, and usually his instincts serve him well. So we'll see where it goes. But I don't know what you think, Dawn, but I think he was like, okay, I have to have a plan now for what I just put in motion.
I think I definitely agree with you. I do think he responded in that moment, but he's not a total bleeding heart because he is able to kind of concoct this long game 6 months. He's kicking the can down the road, basically, like hoping it turns into this bigger disagreement 6 months from now. But I'm trying to remember everything that he does for the town, because he has a public park. He puts safety measures in place. They get a raise. And then there's
park. Isn't that what, Clay, I think it is. Clay, so scornful. Public park.
Yeah.
But of course, I immediately thought about a teeny tiny little Frick Park in Homestead, which was also given to the city of Homestead, I think, after the lockout and strike. But these like small measures of trying to like do the absolute least and still be regarded as this like benevolent source. So I'm not quite sure how they're going to wrap that up in this season. I feel like maybe we're just setting ourselves up for season 3 for a major. We'll be talking about Pittsburgh again and how he's got to go to Pittsburgh, and we'll get there. But I don't know, kind of an unsatisfying end for me. I don't know.
Yeah, something I was thinking about, I'm glad you brought the park up because they mention it a couple of different times. And, it's something that we talk about a lot when we think about the legacy of Henry Clay Frick or men like him, which is they're really difficult historical figures to pin down. And you can have a pretty detailed debate about the benefit of the things that they did leave behind, whether it's something as, like a small park in a neighborhood or a library or these art collections, right? They left good things and they did things with their money that you could make the argument were good. But to your point, Don, I feel like you touched on it, the ultimate question is, does that negate some of the more negative things that they did or the more negative impact that they had? And so, they certainly believed that it was enough to just donate some land for a public park and it was going to be fine. And in some ways, maybe today we are still benefiting from the things that they left behind. But there's a lot of things that were not so good from the decisions they made, whether that's the environmental impact of the industries that they were involved in or the ways that they treated their workers. We talk a lot about the fact that both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think it's interesting that you see that here with George, because I think you're right. He's not totally a bleeding heart. Like he is certainly a father and a husband, but he is also a businessman. And so watching those two things balance is interesting. And it's an interesting nuance in the show for sure. So we have one more thing that we want to do, which is we had a great question from a viewer from last week's episode, which I'm so glad that they mentioned because I honestly didn't notice it, which is that, we have our big public proposal last week with Marian and Dashiell, but we don't ever see an engagement ring. And I don't know if you guys noticed I did not notice if she was wearing one in this episode or not. I wasn't super familiar with the history of engagement rings, but I did kind of a cursory, look into the history of it. Long history. Certainly would have been common as far back as the ancient Romans to wear a ring that would symbolize the intent to marry. We don't get diamond rings that are super popular until the mid 20th century. But I was asking you, Amanda, if you knew anything about Mrs. Frick's engagement ring, if she had one or not. But you said that Mr. Frick gave her diamond earrings instead of a ring.
Don will maybe remember, I should have pulled up the articles, but newspaper articles from December 1881, when Henry and Adelaide Frick get married. I don't know anything about a ring. I don't know if she had a ring. That's a question maybe for a family member or somebody if we have a chance to ask. But the newspapers talk about, and they actually do it in a way that was a little over the top, like these fabulous diamond earrings, right, Don? Like almost in a way that was like focusing on the size and the expense and almost like a little bit of almost an embarrassment maybe in how they flaunt these diamonds.
It definitely feels really gauche, like reading it with today's eyes in the article, because they're just like, oh, the bride was given these, stunning solitaire diamonds that cost $5,000 or something. And that's like, whoa, don't normally see that in wedding announcements.
Yeah, that's an interesting detail to put in there for sure.
That was like a wedding gift, right? It wasn't an engagement thing. That's what he gives her when they're married.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't know of any like engagement ring or wedding ring, but those diamond earrings are very visible. I know we shared an image of Adelaide in her wedding trousseau for an earlier season. So we'll drop another image in and do a little zoom in on the solitaire earrings, and you can see them in an image of them on their honeymoon as well. So she's sporting them for those first several months.
As would I.
I don't blame her. They sound amazing.
No, they're huge.
So yeah, great question. So yeah, it'll be interesting. We know Marian's story with Dashiell is not over. I think one of my favorite parts of the episode is when she kind of forgets that she's engaged at one point, and she's, certainly she's preoccupied with what's going on with Luke and Ada and all of that stuff. But, Larry, I think, makes the comment to her of like, oh, it's too bad that you guys are going through this at a time when you should be celebrating. And she's like, celebrating what? Like, what are we celebrating? And he's like, you got engaged yesterday or the day before. And she's like, oh, right. So yeah, we will see where the relationship with Dashiell and Marian ends up. I can say we are definitely going to see some kind of resolution to that. Maybe not a resolution, but a progression, because next week in our season finale of season 2 of HBO's The Gilded Age, Marian confesses her true feelings while Jack receives welcome news. Bertha and Mrs. Astor make their final moves in the opera war. So we are in for a big finale. I think you're not going to want to miss all of our thoughts, I'm sure, on this. We will try our best to get it all in there. So definitely join us back next week on the Unofficial Gilded Age Aftershow. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe. We are so appreciative of everybody who watches and joins us here every week. It's so much fun, and we really appreciate it. So don't miss next week for our last episode of the season. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.